What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another Carl's Bait and Tackle tips and tricks video. I'm Matt from SBFishingTV. Today we're going to be taking a look at the difference between fishing craws and worms. First up, let's take a look at the obvious. I have the Biospawn Plasma Tail and the Zoom Ultra Vibe Speed Craw here. And as you guys can see, the Speed Craw has a bunch more appendages on it and these two claws here. So this is going to create a ton of action in the water, whereas the Biospawn Plasma Tail is going to be more on the finesse end. The craws are also generally going to be a bit smaller than the worms that you're fishing, but again, they're going to put off a lot more action. So they're two different situations, and when you're out fishing, that's something you always need to keep in mind, is really like how much action these fish want. Sometimes they want something like the plasma tail is just sitting there on a drop shot, or a shaky head just barely moving that tail, and then other times they want something like the Zoom Speed Craw is just flapping around down there, the appendages are flaring out, and it's just really triggering those fish to eat. But let's take a look at these other baits really quickly. We have your old school 7.5 inch culprit worm. So this is, like I just said, like this is the old school tactic of catching bass. Throw this thing on a Texas rig, you really can't go wrong. You fish it everywhere: docks, grass, wood, flipping, dragging it on a Carolina rig, whatever it is, this thing catches fish. And I can tell you that because they really haven't changed the design of this style worm in I don't even know how long. So that is a guaranteed fish catcher there. Next up, we have the Big Bite Baits Crete Tail. And what's really interesting about this bait is it's almost just a stick bait that has an added ribbon tail to it. So it's going to give it a little bit more action, and I'm going to fish this the same way that I'm fishing that ribbon tail from culprit. I was showing you guys the Biospawn Plasma Tail earlier, so this is a 6.5 inch finesse worm. I'm going to fish this on a shaky head and a drop shot. Today I'm going to throw it on the drop shot because I'm fishing in pretty clean water with some grass, and I just like throwing the drop shot around in that situation. But if they're not eating that, I'll throw it on the shaky head to see if they want something pinned to the bottom. But what I really like about the Plasma Tail is that the body tapers down and then it flares back out and creates that teardrop style tail. And when that's down there on the drop shot or the shaky head, you just barely flick your rod and that tail just creates a decent amount of action. And this thing catches a ton of fish. I love this bait. So as far as the craws go today, first up we have the Biospawn Vile Craw. All the craws, honestly, you can just fish in so many different ways. Chatterbait trailers, jig trailers, Carolina rig, Texas rig. You really can't go wrong with fishing craws. They're probably my favorite soft plastic to throw. So the Biospawn Vile Craw, something that's pretty interesting about it, it has this one giant antenna in the middle, which comes down next to the claws here. And these have those flared out claws, which just create a ton of action when it's falling down and when you're hopping it around. Here's another pretty interesting creature styled craw bait. This is the V&M J-Bug. This is almost like a twin-tailed grub with some arms up top. Really great action on this. It has an awesome swimming action. I'm actually fishing this on a swing head jig today, which we're going to get into a little bit later. But you can also throw this on a chatterbait trailer or a jig trailer, Texas rig. Again, just so much versatility with these craw baits, which brings me up last but not least to the Zoom Ultra Vibe Speed Craw. So this is probably one of my favorite chatterbait trailers that you can throw. But Texas rig, Carolina rig, jig trailer, this thing just, you can't go wrong with it. It has a bit more of a finesse presentation, but it does have quite a few appendages on here, and these arms really kick a bunch too. So this is a really great bait when the fish are hitting plastics that have a bunch of action to it. But I'm gonna rig these baits up. We're gonna get into fishing. Alright, so I showed you guys all the baits. Now let me show you what I rigged them up with. So Ultra Vibe Speed Craw, throwing that on a Carolina rig. The V&M J-Bug is going on a swing head jig. Biospawn Plasma Tail, throwing that on a drop shot today. Biospawn Vile Craw is on the trailer of this Perfection Lures stand-up jig. We have the Big Bite Baits Crete Tail on a Texas rig, and I'm also going to throw the culprit ribbon tail worm on this as well. We're going to switch between the two, but that's what I have rigged up. We're going to start off throwing the Biospawn Plasma Tail. There we go. That's a good fish on the plasma tail. Come here. Oh, come on. There we go. It's a solid fish. There we go. That's a really solid fish right there on the drop shot with the plasma tail. So the reason I picked up the plasma tail first was because I was fishing kind of deeper off of this point with a bunch of grass. And I find that working that plasma tail finesse worm through the grass is a little bit easier than say a craw, because the craw is going to pick up a lot of that grass and your cast is kind of ruined sometimes. But it's not to say you can't do it. You can, absolutely. But I just opted for the plasma tail first. Also, the water's pretty clean, so these fish I know are a little bit skittish. So that's where a little bit more of a finesse style bait is gonna catch you fish just like this. Really good looking fish. It's probably 3.5 pounds. And there was one just as big chasing it up. So I'm gonna put it back and see if we can get another one. The plasma tail on the drop shot, and I was barely moving this thing. I mean, cast it out, let it hit the bottom, and just slow dragging it back to the boat. Really letting this worm just do all the work for me. Just pulling it through the grass, popping it over the grass, letting it sit there. That was a good fish. We're gonna try the speed craw and see if these fish have a preference today. You'll find a lot of times that fish will hit both craws and worms in the same day. I think that's something you really need to play around with and kind of experiment with when you're out on the water. I can't say, you know, oh, in March only throw craws or only throw worms, because that's very much not true. It's just something you need to play around with when you're out on the water. But there are going to be times where the fish prefer one over the other. I'm gonna just drag this speed craw around on the Carolina rig for a little bit, pull it through this grass. They should eat it. All right. Here's a fish on the speed craw for you guys. I Texas rigged it. I moved up closer on this point where I caught that fish on the drop shot, and I wanted to get on the edge of that grass. He ate it right up, right at the boat. Solid little 2-pounder. See ya. Another quick tip for you guys is keep in mind the size of the bait that you're throwing. So the fish that I caught, and I also had another bite on this speed craw, I may be able to pick up that biospawn vial craw and catch one, or I may not. So this has a pretty finesse presentation to it. It's really small. It's probably only 3.5 inches. Whereas that vial craw has a much larger body to it, and it's gonna move a lot more water, whereas this is just a little bit more finesse. I also really like throwing smaller craws like this in areas of grass. I think it just gets through it a little bit easier. I still think that these fish are gonna react a little bit better to this smaller bait today. All right, we're gonna move over and fish another point, and on our way, we're gonna talk about when you should be throwing worms over craws and craws over worms. So when I'm fishing deeper and I think the bite is a little bit tough and you need more of a finesse presentation, that's when I'm gonna pick up a worm, whether that's on a Texas rig or a drop shot or whatever it may be. Something just a little bit smaller with less action, I find, is a little bit better in that situation, whereas a craw is constantly moving around, moving a ton of water, making a ton of action, and that's where I'll stick with the worm. Now on the flip side of that, if the fish are eating really good and they're keying in on bigger baits, that's when I'll pick up the craw. If they want something that's moving around a bunch and has a ton of action, that's another time I'm picking up the craw. And especially when the fish are tight to wood or grass and they're shallow, I'm gonna throw a Texas rigged craw or a jig around. And that's not to say the worm won't work. There's been plenty of times out there where they were eating the craw and the bite just turned off and I switched over to a worm, ribbon tail worm, or just a finesse worm, and the bite picked back up. So keep that in mind when you're out on the water. Just let the fish tell you what they want, and you should be able to get some more bites that way. Alright, here we go. Got another one on the drop shot. I think it's a finesse kind of day. They want small craws and finesse worms. There we go, little guy. Something else I wanted to mention really quickly was basically you can fish worms and craws in any given situation. The only difference I see between the two is a craw is going to have a little bit more versatility to it. You can throw them on jig trailers, chatterbait. You can throw them as trailers, whether it's a jig or a chatterbait. I mean, not to say you can't throw the worm on those as well, but that's just something that I personally don't do. But yeah, if you want to beef up a jig or just throw something with a little bit bigger presentation, that's where I'm going to go with the craw. Whereas if the fish are being a little bit more finicky and you need more of a finesse presentation, that's when I'm going to pick up the ribbon-tail worm or the plasma tail. Going with the culprit ribbon-tail. Old school bass fishing. Just going to drag this around some of these grass stalks and mats. We're going to see if we can get on a similar bite like we did with the craw. This is a good test right now. When I'm fishing the ribbon-tail worm, just standard Texas rig style fishing, I'm just casting it out, letting it sink to the bottom, and just giving it 1 or 2 solid little hops, and then letting it rest. A lot of times the fish are going to eat it either right when you hop it at the apex of the hop, or when it's just resting there on the bottom. Keep an eye on your line. A lot of times they'll just pick it up and start running off with it. Also, obviously, right when you cast that initial fall of the worm or any Texas rig bait that you're throwing, a lot of your bites are going to come that way too. I was messing around throwing the J-bug on the drop shot for a little bit, but I really think these darker colors in this water right now are just making it a little bit too hard. With the water being so clean and it being so bright out, I think they want more natural colors. But I just threw another plasma tail on the drop shot. We're going to drag it through this area and see if we can't get some of these fish to bite. Alright, so I just spent probably 30 minutes throwing the Carolina rig around with the Crete tail. Not even a bite. As soon as I switched over to the Carolina rig, it's just like, I don't think the bite turned off per se, but I really just don't think that these fish want one of these worms right now. And this is one of the situations where I'm going to pick up a football head jig with the Biospawn Vial Crawl and throw the crawl around a bit, pick the drop shot back up. I think it's more of a smaller bait kind of deal today, and that's something you need to keep in mind when you're out on the water. If you're fishing one bait and they're eating it, whether it's a craw or a worm, and then you switch up to see if you can catch a bigger fish or continue to catch more fish, and that bite turns off, you need to switch back to whatever it was that you're using, and just keep in mind the size of the bait and the color. That could be another thing. I only have the Crete tail in black. The water's pretty clean. This just might be too dark of a color today, but keep these tips in mind when you're out on the water, and you should be able to get a few more bites. We're gonna pick up the football head jig and work that around this point a little bit. Alright guys, that's gonna be it for me today. I think what it comes down to when you're fishing craws and worms is really just the situation of the day. If the fish are a little finicky and you think you need more of a finesse style technique, go with a worm. If they're eating bigger baits and they're being really active and they want something with a bunch of action, pick up a craw. So that's what it comes down to when it comes to fishing worms and craws for me. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure you hit that subscribe button on Mystery Tackle Box's YouTube channel, and we'll see you